Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming today. I'm so excited to be able to talk about this topic. As you can see, it's actually a presentation I did for the National Eczema Association earlier this year. And one of the reasons why I got interested in this topic is because I used to have eczema myself. And I remember distinctly that so much of managing it was not just the physical aspects of it, but the mental and psychological was just as important. So I really wanted to spend some time talking about this because I don't feel like this is something that we talk about a lot. And oftentimes in our meetings with our dermatologists and our other practitioners, we don't always have the time to talk about these things. So that's why I wanted to bring this up today. So let's start from the very beginning and let's talk about how eczema actually affects us from a psychological perspective. So we know that lots of times what it can make us do is focus on what if. And to a large degree, you spend so much time going, oh my gosh, oh my gosh, oh my gosh. So then we end up making that what if turn into something even larger and we start catastrophizing and starting to think of like the worst case scenario of things that can happen to us. We also, because of all of these things that are going on in our mind, oftentimes get really distracted and are unable to do things that are right in front of us, whether they be the responsibilities of our lives or various different tasks. They can oftentimes interfere with our relationships. There's a lot of different ways that happens. I remember I was so focused on doing all the things that I thought I needed to do that I was forgetting that I should actually have relationships with people because I was like, I have to do this, I have to do this, I have to do this. So that's another area. And then there's a lot of times we can be really, really obsessive about what we're thinking about, but we're not actually leading ourselves to a place where we can make decisions about something and then actually change. And the biggest thing that happens is obviously everything that we're talking about here is we're kind of not being part of the present anymore, and we're all about where we were in the past. So that oftentimes can make us feel incredibly helpless, really hopeless, and a lot of times out of control. So the things that I used to remember thinking about in terms of like the what ifs were, well, what if I have a flare in the middle of whatever special occasion meeting and then I wouldn't go to it because of it? Or how about what if I do this activity and it makes me flare? Like it's going to make me sweat or it's going to make me hotter or whatever. And then I go into a flare and like, I don't want that to happen. So then I wouldn't go to that activity. I had a lot of allergies, or at least I had a lot of things that seemed to trigger things randomly. So I remember thinking, well, what if I go to a restaurant and I eat something and it makes me flare and then I can't have fun with the people I'm with? And I also remember having some lesions that were all over my body, and particularly in places that people could see, whether they be on my neck or my hands or my arms. And I remember thinking to myself, gosh, what if somebody sees this and they actually like say something and they make me feel bad, or they had done it before. And so I would assume that that might happen again. So then I would kind of not want to be placed in situations where this would happen. I also probably did a lot of times like did some amount of quote unquote mind reading, thinking that other people wouldn't accept me as much if they actually saw my eczema. And it actually was backed up a few times when people actually saw things and they kind of cringed and they made a face. And I thought, oh my gosh, like no one's ever gonna like me if this is the situation. Um, the other thing is, I think lots of times I remember having really bad flares, and I thought to myself, well, gosh, if this happens in the middle of some place, like I don't know if I'm going to be ready to be able to handle that. And then I think one of the things that happens in this day and age is a lot of people try to find a community on the internet, but then there's all these people who have these really, really dire situations that are way worse than probably the situation you're in. But then you start to think, well, gosh, what if I end up being like that person too? And then you start having those what ifs as well. So a lot of times I remember thinking, okay, I'm doing well right now, but I must be ready for a flare. And so that means like I couldn't really stay in the present. So the thing that happens in our brain is if we think ideas, we actually think they're true. And so that's a real problem when we have these kinds of thoughts. And the biggest problem is that oftentimes what's happening is that we're thinking that all of this is happening inside of our brains, but it's not really we don't really have information that's saying specifically that that's true. Sometimes what we're actually thinking is not really true. And it makes us more depressed feeling, it makes us more insecure, it makes us more uncertain. And sometimes it actually makes us not feel good about ourselves in general. So this keeps us really stuck inside the box. And that's what I'm talking about today is like how we kind of keep us in this smaller area rather than being in the bigger world. So let's talk a little bit about what worry actually is. It's actually not really based on what's likely to happen. What it's really based on is what would be terrible if something did happen. And it's not really based on probability. It's something that we base totally on fear. So I always like to talk about the F word, and that's what fear really stands for. And that's false evidence appearing real. So there's other ways that we actually stay in the box too. We overgeneralize. It's like one situation happens once, then we think it's going to happen every single time. Again, what I was talking about before, mind reading, we decide that people think these things about us, even though they've never even said anything to that effect. We tend to go to this place of really maximizing the bad probabilities instead of being really realistic about what truly is happening at this moment. And this is a big one. We really minimize our ability to adapt to those situations, despite the fact that this was happening to me over and over again, the flares. And I was actually living through them. For some reason, I started to, really discount like my ability to get through these things. You do some amount of fortune telling, you sort of decide like what your future is going to be instead of actually letting it happen. And then it's very black and white, like it's either is or it's not, and there's nothing that can possibly be in between. And then as a result, like lots of times we can use eczema as our excuse not to do something. So we stay in the box. So I love this saying. I'm going to move this up because I can't see it. The subconscious mind cannot tell the difference between what's real and what's imagined. So anything that we have in our brain seems real. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about why this actually happens. So there's something in our brain called the amygdala, and it's responsible for handling our fight or flight response. Um, you would think that the other parts of our brain would be able to override that, specifically the cerebral cortex. But it's interesting. The amygdala doesn't actually think. What it does do is it takes information from your eyes and ears, and it's always scanning the outside world to figure out, are you in danger? Is something going to happen? It doesn't use language as the way to indicate what it should do next. It bases everything on the past. And so what it does is it jumps to action whenever it thinks that you might be unsafe. But the problem is it's not a really good judge of what's safe and what isn't. It just believes that if there's any amount of uncertainty, that's got to be bad, that's going to be awful. So let's do everything we can to get you out of harm's way. And back in the day, that actually was a very helpful thing for us to have in our system, because back in the day, we were fighting things like lions, tigers, and bears. We needed to survive. But in order to have that kind of survival mode, we actually have to assume the worst. We actually have to over personalize and overestimate what these threats are so that we can actually motivate the body to combat that. And what it does is totally underestimate your ability to handle these threats. And so it totally jumps to conclusions. So the fact is, safety or doing whatever it takes to be safe does not necessarily mean that you're going to be a happy person or that you're going to be the most successful person ever. In fact, the survival mindset really, really insists that you have to know what an outcome is. Otherwise, you're going to just feel this edge all the time. And so that's why we have that in our brains. So I saw this study that was really interesting. It kind of illustrates like how much we depend on certainty in order to feel good. And so there was this study that they found that if they told people that they were going to be shocked, like every 15 minutes or something like that, people actually felt okay with that versus not knowing for sure how often they were going to be shocked. So the certainty of being shocked was okay with people, but people who were like not going to get as many shocks but had no idea when they were to come, like were so scared out of their mind because of that. So it really goes to show like how much like we want to know what's going on at all times. Otherwise, we start to feel really anxious. Okay, so earlier I was talking about the cerebral cortex, and this can definitely be that function that allows us to say, no, this is not that dangerous. It's okay. But the interesting thing about our brain is that the way the neural connections work is that between the amygdala and the cerebral cortex, it's a one-way street. The cerebral cortex can't talk to the amygdala and shut it down and say, hey, stop, knock it off. This is crazy talk. Instead, the amygdala just sends the message to the cortex, and the cortex goes, okay, let's go. So as a result, the amygdala bases all the actions of what we do on memories and not present day. So we are locked to our memories. And so you're probably thinking, well, that's not good. That doesn't sound like there's much hope for us, but there is. Because while we can't erase those memories, we can make new ones and we can make them a lot more dominant. And then we don't have to worry about these kinds of things as much. Okay, so I love this quote from Albert Einstein. He said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. So what we're trying to do is do something different. Okay, so let's talk about how can we actually start to think outside of the box. Okay, so before I get into this, I do want to recognize that obviously everybody comes in at different levels of this condition, that some people are at a much more severe place. Also, there's very different personality types, and some people might just have heightened anxiety to begin with. Also, circumstances can make it very different for people. So what I would really love is, kind of have an open mind when you listen to this and see what works best for you, where it sounds like it would be something that you could incorporate. I'm not saying that every single one of these things is something that is perfect for you, but maybe from some of them you can find something. And the other thing I want to say is that I also think this applies to general life overall. You don't have to have eczema to actually apply these things. I think it does help whenever we're uncomfortable in life and we actually want to grow as people. So, all right, so I've got 10 different ways that we can think outside of the box. So let's start with number one. So let's start a little bit going back to talk about like, what is it that we're trying to achieve here? So there's a really big difference between when we're really contracting, which is, being in that box, and we're a little bit more expansive or more open to everything. So what we want to do is actually focus on what are those things that make us more expansive. So contraction is definitely a natural part of life, and we always go through this, whether or not we have eczema, all different situations that can make us a little uncomfortable at first. We're going to probably contract a little bit before we actually grow out. We typically rely on this whenever we're in any kind of stressful situation, and it is definitely a coping mechanism, but we don't want it to get in the way of our life. So when we are contracted, this is how we typically feel. We feel heavy, we feel really frustrated, we feel disappointed, we're bored, we're upset, we're sad, we're anxious. But when we're feeling expansive, we feel light, we feel optimistic, we feel happy, we feel peaceful, we feel hopeful, and we feel alive, which I think is the most important one. Okay, so here's sort of an illustration of like the difference between contracting and expanding, being in that box and only seeing a little part of the sky, or being expansive where we can see the whole picture. So this is what we're trying to work towards, the expansion. And that's where we get most of our growth and transformation and happiness. Okay, so the first thing we can do is a test. So when we think about doing something, and if in the case of eczema, where I was talking about like not going to a party or not going to some social event or whatever, think about it in terms of the idea itself
regardless of your skin, the idea of itself, does it make you feel more contracted or expansive? Which side does it make you feel like? And that can kind of give you an indication of whether or not you might want to do it or should do it. All right, then the second part of that test is think about this in terms of if there is a problem right now in terms of your skin, is there anything in the external world that's causing that? And if there is there something that you can actually do about it? So this is all about control. How much of like whatever you're thinking is going on is something that is truly something that we can change, or is it just something that it's just going to be? So those are two things to just think about. Okay. The other thing is, in terms of uncertainty, I think, we oftentimes want to know what the future is going to hold, but let's be honest, all of life is uncertain. There's nothing in it that's certain. And then when we get into these situations where we have a skin condition that starts to make our thinking, wind down a little bit, we tend to go even smaller and like then we really are depending on knowing like what's going to happen next, what's going to happen next. So we need to remember that all of life is uncertain and that we need to kind of just surrender to whatever that unknown is going to be and just let it play out. Another thing that a lot of psychologists talk about is developing uncertainty tolerance. And so it's this idea of continuously putting yourself in a situation that you might not know what's going to happen. And then after it happens, recognize that you actually survived and you're fine, and maybe even grew from that. And then the next time, do another thing that's just a little bit more. And then keep putting yourself in these situations so that you can build this understanding of yourself that you can do it and you can actually get through these things. Looking for the opportunity in the difficult. So I was just having a conversation with a friend yesterday about how lots of times when we have done something that was actually kind of scary or a little bit more hard, we actually ended up growing as a person. And so I think lots of times we focus on how uncomfortable we are in this particular new thing or whatever. But what we should think about is, hey, what did I actually get out of that? Like that was actually a positive thing in the long run. And that's actually making me a better person. Also go into things with an unmade mind. I think we have a tendency to go into these situations when we have eczema thinking, oh my gosh, the last time I did this, this is what happened. And so this is going to happen again. But instead, go into this is today. I'm a different person today. I'm in a different situation with my eczema today. Let's just see how it plays out. And if it does go a certain way, like just know that you will be able to deal with it because you've done it before. Focus on what you can control. I think this is a big one. It was a big one for me. I think all the time I was always thinking about all the things that I could not control, and that was making me more crazy. Let's just focus on the things that we can do. If we know that a certain thing that we bring with ourselves, with a moisturizer, or there's a typical management thing that we do, like let's just remember that we have that in place, and that we can draw on that if we need it. Oops. Oh, and then I like to always think of things as adventures that instead of thinking of like, I mean, I do a lot of hiking and there are moments where, you don't know where you're going to go next, but then you turn the corner and something beautiful happens. Or, sometimes you stumble and you do something to your ankle or whatever, but then you live to talk about it. So I always like to think of things as, everything that you do in life is an adventure. And, whatever happens, like you will be able to get something out of it and it'll be interesting. Okay, number four. I think there's a tendency to like have a lot of these different kinds of negative thoughts or a tendency to think about your anxiety and it continues to have all these different thoughts. So one of these psychologists, David Carbonell, actually had a book called The Worry Trick. And he talked a lot about, how do you actually get yourself to be a little bit more aware of like how often you're worrying, and then is there something you can do about it? So one of the things he suggested is that you actually get a pack of Tic Tacs, and every single time you find yourself thinking about something, take a Tic Tac out and put it into maybe an empty Tic Tac box. And as the day goes on, just kind of see like how often is this happening? I thought that was an interesting thing because sometimes we don't realize how much of our day is being dedicated to this kind of thought. And as we actually see physically, how that actually adds up. I think sometimes then we can be much more aware of what it's doing to us. And then we can actually start to work on how can we actually limit this. So after you know what you're typically doing, then you have a chance to actually think about, do I actually need to think about it every single day, every single moment, every single hour? And then is there a way each day that if you were to do the tic tac count, could we reduce that? And I'm going to give you some other ways to do that as well. So that's one thing to start. So you at least know where your baseline is. So another thing that the same psychologist talked about was repeating something 25 times, because if you actually hear yourself saying this, after a while, it just will not affect you as much. It becomes something that just is innocuous to you if you do that. So what he does is he takes it to a whole different level where you basically take your worst worry and you exaggerate it, and then you repeat it 25 times, and then it becomes innocuous to you. So for example, I always was a little afraid that like someone was going to see my eczema and then they were going to, wince or whatever. So here's an example of something that he would say to do. So your example of the thought that you would think 25 times is, what if someone sees my eczema and is so grossed out by it that they run screaming from me, making everyone else along their path look at me, laugh at me, and point at me, that the entire area becomes congested with people and a major traffic jam ensues for the next 3 hours. Like, obviously, that's the most ridiculous idea. That's never really going to happen. But if you say this to yourself 25 times, at some point you're just going to laugh at yourself and go, yeah, that's not going to happen. We're going to be okay. That's fine. And it's that 25 times that actually makes this a lot less um, uh, of a problem for you. Like you'll end up making it turn into something that's not going to affect you as much. So it's the 25 times that makes the difference. Okay. And then another one is engage in the external world. Um, as you know, that box is small. And so if you know that you're in the box, like just go outside. The outside world is so much bigger than that box is allowing us to be. And if you focus on the things that you actually see out there, you're letting yourself be out externally focused instead of internally focused. So one of the things that I like to do just for myself, to keep myself sane, is to go out into either where I live or a forest preserve or whatnot, and just focus on different things that I see. I used to take pictures and make myself take pictures and find things to take pictures of, because then I was always focused on something else out there instead of what's going on inside. I actually made it into a whole thing where I started to like post them on Facebook, where every single day I would have to find something to post on Facebook. And so then that would just keep on making me focus on the outside. So go out into the external world, let yourself think about things that are outside of your head, and that'll keep you a little bit more balanced. Also, just accept the discomfort now for the comfort later. Obviously, being in the box sometimes feels like it's comfortable, but it's not going to be if you allow yourself to like go outside and realize that there's so much more. Okay, number 7, do stuff. Now, a lot of people think, well, that's just so you can drown out the thoughts that you have in your head, but it's really not about that. What they find is that if you're actually physically doing something, like you actually are using your brain for other things and you don't feel this need to worry. And then as you're physically doing things, you're actually generating a lot more energy in yourself. You're actually probably getting endorphins in your system too. Movement is a big deal. So the worry, it actually will start to reduce a little bit if you're actually moving, and doing stuff gets you moving. Okay. For those of us who worry a lot, I mean, just have a worry date. Just decide that every single day at this time for 10 minutes, you're going to worry, and you're going to stand in front of the mirror and just out loud in front of the mirror Tell yourself every single thing that you're worried about for 10 minutes. And then when the alarm clock goes off for the 10 minutes, you're done. And so every single day you can promise yourself that, okay, for this amount of time, I'm allowed to be as worried as possible. I can get them all out. And then after that, no more. You have to go on with life. Okay, number 9. Um, Breathing is a really big deal. In this country, we shallow breathe so much that we're actually not getting enough air in our body, which is causing a lot of other physical ailments as well. But really, what it does is allow us to actually activate the parasympathetic nervous system, which is actually what calms us down and makes us feel, grounded and all those kinds of things. So breathing is a really big deal. So it manages a lot of the physical symptoms that come with anxiety. So if we do this on a regular basis and we incorporate it into our life, we can really bring down a lot of that mental, psychological energy that's kind of going awry, and we can actually bring it back to a place that feels more balanced and feels better. So one of the ways to do this is you can place your hand on your chest and the other one on your belly, and then you can inhale through your nose for a count of 4. And then you want to make sure that like your belly is expanding because that means the air is going deeply into you instead of just stopping at the lungs. And then you want to be able to keep it in your body for a few minutes, and then you want it, not minutes, for a few counts, and then exhale it all out. And then you do that again. And you will be amazed at like how quickly you will feel so much more calm. The first few times that I did this, I was like, yeah, 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 come on. I have all these thoughts in my head. How can I possibly, breathe a couple times and then have myself feel better? But believe it or not, your parasympathetic system can kick in pretty quickly. And if you do this every day, then, it'll be a great exercise for you. The stress will leave your body while your mind becomes calm, as it says here. All right. And then lastly, mindfulness meditation. Now, I know lots of times meditation sounds like it might be a little woohoo or whatever, but honestly, if you just sit for 15 minutes and just let your thoughts fly, that's meditation. Um, I think what happens during meditation is that you're just accepting what is going through your head instead of actually taking each thought, analyzing it, making it more than it is, whatnot. Just sit for 15 minutes, let every single thought that comes through your head just pass by you as if it's a screen. And don't even think about analyzing it. Just let it go. Just let it go by, like you're just watching things happen past you. And then you'll be amazed at like if you can incorporate this every day into your life as well, that it actually does bring a lot of calmness to you. Okay, so let's just review. So eczema can oftentimes make us contract. It can make us get stuck in the box like this picture shows. A lot of our past experiences are what's making us create this kind of fear, and that's what's kind of making us stay in this box. And the uncertainty that this fear creates is what makes that box feel safe. But the biggest problem about all of this is that we end up missing our lives and we miss so many great things that are part of that. So we always have to remember that life is uncertain, life is scary, life is messy, it's unpredictable, and it's not always easy. And no matter what you have, whether it's eczema or anything else, I mean, people can be insensitive no matter what. You don't have to have eczema for people to do that. So we have to stop thinking about eczema as like the issue that's causing us all of this pain and suffering in this world. It's a lot of times it's what we actually attach to all of these things. So life doesn't need to be perfect to be wonderful. So all these different ideas that I shared with you today, see which one feels right for you, whether it's the self-test of figuring out whether or not you're contracting or expanding whenever you think of something that you want to put yourself into, thinking about, is there something you can actually change with this situation, or is it just the way it is? Flipping how we think about uncertainty, doing the tic-tac track, the repeat for 25 times, engaging with the external world, doing stuff, having worry dates in front of your mirror, doing the belly breathe, or doing mindfulness meditation. These are all ways that we can think outside the box. And you know what? Let's go one step further. Let's not just think outside the box. Let's think like there is no box. And that way we can live our best life. So if you want to have any more free information, you can go to my website. I actually do write a lot of different articles about mental health and how eczema plays into that. And so thank you so much for letting me share this information with you today. It's really been my honor. If there's any questions, I am happy to take them now.
Wow, that was really good. That was really helpful, honestly. I had never thought before about how much my daughter's struggling with, but I see it in what you've described. What I'm wondering about is how would we actually get an appointment with you for a consultation? Are you in Chicago? Where
Yeah,
are you?
so I probably should have started with this. I'm actually a traditional Chinese medicine herbalist, so I'm not a psychologist. But I do a lot of talking with my patients because in Chinese medicine, we actually do feel that emotional, psychological aspects of the condition are as important to deal with and address as the physical. And herbal medicine actually is prescribed to actually address all of those different issues as well. So I do end up talking to my patients probably a little bit more often about mental psychological issues in general. And because I had the experience of having eczema and knew that this was a huge part of what I was dealing with, I'm really interested in understanding this more. Why does it happen? How can we help patients so that they can, manage this part of the condition too? So, if you're interested in Chinese medicine, then that would be the reason to come to see me. But if you're interested in more emotional, psychological support, I would probably refer you to a psychologist.
I'm actually interested in the Chinese medicine. I had read your credentials, and that's why I think it might really be beneficial to have an appointment with you.
Yeah, well, if you go on my website, all the information is there. There's Sorry, I'm like losing my voice. There is a video that you can watch to better understand like how I actually work. And then, there's a sign up to actually set up an initial intake. So thank
Great,
you.
great.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I mean, this is super interesting, and it's great when your eczema is managed and I mean, more or less, but what about like I can't see myself do these things when like I can't go to work or I can't sleep at all. So I'm just wondering what you have to add to that effect. Like when it really takes over your whole life, which happens sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different degrees of where you are in your condition. And some of these things are not going to be as easy to do when you are in the more severe parts of it. I think there's a lot of different, I mean, I could probably talk about this topic forever, and there's probably a lot more things I could talk about, but we only had so much time today. So this is what I would say. Um, these are probably people who are, light to moderate in terms of their severity. And then as we get to be more serious, that where your entire life is impacted and you're unable to, go to work, go to school, do all those kinds of things, these particular methods may not be the best or easiest. And that would be a whole nother presentation. So, like I said, I recognize that there's a lot of different levels of severity, but I could only talk about so much today. So that will be my next talk.
Yeah, of course. I was just curious if there was anything that you wanted to add about it, but thank you.
Dr. Friedman, thank you so much for your talk. That was wonderful. Marie, to your point, I'm a pediatric dermatologist in Houston, but I've actually worked with Dr. Olivia. I've consulted her for some of my patients, and we've kind of worked together on them. And we've had a couple of patients who had pretty severe eczema, and I will say what seemed to help them most is while we were treating them medically, and Dr. Olivia was doing everything she could from an herbal perspective, and I was doing kind of more from the medical perspective. A lot of what also helped both our patients and their families cope with all of that is to focus on these things too, because those were in their control. So much of, especially when things are so severe, it seems so out of control. And I loved what Dr. Olivia mentioned about just we often kind of stay in that box because, even though we don't like it and we want things to change, that pain and that suffering is certain. Like that's what we know. We don't know what's out there in the unknown, and that fear just kind of consumes and overwhelms us. And my gosh, it could be even worse than what it is now. But what if it's better? And like Dr. Louie was saying, like we often create our future based on our experience of the past and expect a different outcome. And the only place that we can create some kind of change and that we seek in our lives is in that kind of present moment, in that uncertainty. So in some ways, it's almost kind of embracing like, yeah, life really sucks right now, but it's in that discomfort that we discover our strength and what we're capable of. And when we kind of push ourselves a little bit and challenge ourselves in new ways, that's where we develop our self-confidence. That's where we start to get back our hope and be curious about like what's possible and all the different ways that we can heal. So I kind of liked what she talked about when she's saying like just come up with what is the worst case scenario, because most of the time it's not going to be that worst case, the absolute most exaggerated worst case scenario that there is, because then it starts to kind of desensitize that worry a little bit. It helps us anticipate it. It helps us kind of play it out in our heads and how we would respond. And then it kind of loses its power and the anxiety of it. Like if I go out there and people start asking me about eczema, if I've already kind of played it out in my head about what I want to say about it, or maybe what I don't want to say about it, maybe it's a time that you know what, it's just, I don't really want to talk about it. That's fine. But then it takes our power and our choice back in how we get what story we put out about ourselves and what we're experiencing.
I love that. Thank you, Dr. Dulapali. Anything else?
No, I'll be sharing that. I see that it's been recorded. Peter, is it going to be available if someone wanted to watch it later?
Yep, you'll get an email this afternoon or evening, and there'll
Okay,
be a link to the YouTube.
great. That'll be great.
My
Thank you.
favorite, I just want to say my favorite slide or was the one where you talked about the release and the expansion and how to decide what to do or like whether or not you should go somewhere. And that was really helpful. I particularly like that one and how you feel like if it's just the worry or if it's actually how you're feeling that you shouldn't go, then that was really helpful to me.
Yeah, I think it's the separation of those different ideas, right? And not, assuming that because you don't want to go that like that's the right thing to do. Like we kind of have to like analyze it a little bit and take it apart. Like, well, why are we thinking this way? Why, what would be the worst thing that could happen? And, could we actually get something good out of it? So you're absolutely right. I think there is like this tendency to have one-way thinking. And I think that's probably the biggest message I'm trying to get is that if we just think about like why is this happening to us, I think we'll have better control over it and we'll have a better way to actually think about it as we're, going through flares or having moments where, we have a little bit of self-doubt because of what's happened before. So I definitely think that, anybody who goes through this, as Dr. Julipali said, definitely becomes a stronger person as a result because you are challenged with all kinds of things that most people don't. And getting through that is actually proof that you're so much more than you thought you were. I definitely think that it was great training for me to go out into the world and do a lot of other things that I have done. I no longer struggle with eczema at all, but it definitely taught me that like I can get through just about anything if I just, put my mind towards it and just do it. And so, I had a lot of negative talk in my head in terms of, people's reactions to me and things like that. But I then realized, I then became a leader in my profession, and I actually am the chair of the ASA, the American Society of Acupuncturists, and I get criticized all the time. But because I went through this whole, lifetime of seeing people not react to me in the way that I always wanted them to be or the most positive, like I have a thicker skin and it's not a big deal now when things like that happen. So I think at the end of the day, in some ways, what you think is your weakness is also your superpower. And you just have to start thinking about it that way. I see a question here.
Yeah.
Srandini.
Serenity. Hi.
I'm
Thank you for
sorry.
No, you're completely fine. Thank you for the presentation. I was curious if you or Dr. Leo had recommendations for psychologists in the Chicagoland area that have specialized in eczema or patients with skin conditions. As someone who's been going to therapy, I feel like it's difficult to kind of educate a therapist who isn't so aware with skin conditions and the traumas of eczema or whatever one's dealing with. So I was wondering if you guys have contact lists for that.
Yeah, I think Dr. Leo probably has a better list in Chicago. I tend to work with people all over the world, so I don't have expertise in every single state or city. But I will say this, I think the choice of a therapist is incredibly personal, and I
Mhm.
don't think every single person that's out there is the right person for you. I mean, not you personally, but people in general. I do think it's one of those things where you have to find the right person. It's not that different than the perfect friend and the perfect marriage and all that kind of stuff. It's finding that person that really resonates with you and talks to you in a way that you need them to. And I think that everybody has different styles, and sometimes that can be hard because you have to go through a couple people before you actually find the one that's right for you. But if you find that right one, it can be magical. I mean, it can be so great in terms of really bringing you to a place that you need, finding the support that you need, and being able to reframe different ways that you're thinking about things. But it could also be the opposite if you don't find that right person. So I really do think taking the time to really, you know, go to their website, see if they're using words that really resonate with you, or even the way they look, like sometimes that can help you kind of make decisions on whether or not this feels right. I think that's a really important choice. So I think Dr. Leo just put something in the chat.
I put a couple of different names in the chat that are kind of in the Chicagoland area. And then Lisa Lombard she's a therapist and a hypnotherapist, and her whole practice is virtual. So I have people see her from kind of all over. She's fantastic. She really does a little bit more on hypnosis and meditation and relaxation. So she's a little bit different, but also a really fantastic resource.
And
Thank you.
she's actually done a few presentations for Chicago Integrative Eczema Center too. So any other thoughts? Any other things that you wish you had? I know that there were some parts that Marie wanted to know a little bit more about. Were there any other areas that other people wanted to hear more about, or give me ideas of other presentations I can put together for the future?
I'm just very interested in getting my daughter to see you personally, so I'll be going to your website. Thank
All
you.
right. Well, I think that's it then.
Thank you so much, Olivia, for doing this. And thanks everybody for coming. You'll get an email late tonight or tomorrow with the video link and information about the next meeting. And I hope to see everybody soon.
Great. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.